Good morning and welcome to the special lecture. The topic of today's lecture is Union Budget 2025 and new RBI MPC decisions, any policy coordination. And to speak on this subject, today we have with us Professor Lekha Chakraborty. And I am sure that all of you are familiar with Professor Lekha Chakraborty, and she needs no introduction because all of you have already attended many of her classes, and some of you might have seen her newspaper articles, and you might have listened to her budget discussions organized by different organizations. So we couldn't organize a union budget discussion so far because we had our students had examination up to yesterday, and so today itself we could conduct a program, and I am extremely grateful to Professor Lekha for frequently visiting this department and delivering a large number of lectures. Today also she is going to speak on the union budget and RBI MPC decisions. So, on behalf of the Department of Economics, I extend hearty welcome to Professor Lekha Chakraborty. Hearty welcome to each and every one of you. And I think some online participants are also there, so hearty welcome to all of you. Thank you. Now I request Lekha Chakraborty to deliver that.
Thank you so much for coming for my lecture, and also online participants, welcome. Now let me get to the topic. Okay, now let me get into the topic. My topic we discussed, Shija and I discussed, is to deliver a talk on the policy coordination between the RBI with the new MPC decisions and the Ministry of Finance related to the Union Budget 2025. There is a policy coordination over there when we think about the economic growth recovery process. So let me first unpack a few decisions taken by RBI before I enter into the Union Budget, when we'll open that document a little later. So recently we have a new RBI governor, Sanjay Malhotra. He was in the Ministry of Finance. So there's a policy coordination. So he came as an RBI governor now. And the new MPC meeting under the new RBI governor, Sanjay Malhotra, they have taken a remarkable decision of reducing the policy rates by 25 bps. So otherwise it was like they were going on hawkish mode for a long time. Now they have reduced the interest rate. So what is the backdrop for the reduction in the policy rate? If you ask me, it's like geopolitical uncertainties are now there. It's not that everything vanished. We have that foreign crisis and geopolitical uncertainties, supply chain disruptions, everything is there. But the global inflation was little easier. And also, the Ministry of Finance, they were doing heavy lifting in terms of the capital infrastructure investment, and now they are running the last mile. The private investment is not pitching in. So Somnath, the expenditure secretary, he also mentioned that the power of the fiscal space and the power of fiscal authority for an economic recovery process, we are reaching the last mile. Now it's the RBI. RBI has a role to play in triggering economic growth. So what is the potential growth rate of India? The potential growth rate of India put forward by the RBI, if you look at the estimates, like we can safely say that India will grow at 7%. So if you ask me whether it is a great dip in the economic growth, if you put the potential as 7, it is not much. But still, we are envisioning that by 2047, we will be into a developed country status. So 7 is not enough. We need to work more. But the potential, and you know that how this potential GDP is arrived at, right? Because it's an unobserved variable. How a country developed or what is the potential for a country to be in the GDP potential. So if you ask me, it is generally, it's an unobserved variable. It's generally computed through the econometric methodology. We use filters and all. Okay, you take that series of GDP, it has cyclicality, trend and a trend potential, right? So take out the cyclicality and we can use the filters and work out the potential. So that is one way of doing it. There are many ways of doing the potential output because it's an unobserved variable. You need to compute it. The other is a protection function approach. We can use different filters, Kalman or HT or different filters. But basically, potential is what is achievable. Like, what is your potential? If I ask, you have a say on that, right? Then you try to attain over there. And there is a gap here in the economy, that is output gap. That is a major macroeconomic variable. The central bank and the North Block and the Ministry of Finance, they grapple with. And that macroeconomic variable is your output gap. There is a deviation from the output, the potential output, and you need to close that gap. So, if you ask me what is the policy coordination about, and what is the main function of the fiscal and monetary policy authorities, it is reducing the gap, reducing this output gap. But this macroeconomic variable output gap, it is a very difficult variable to explain theoretically and methodologically. So theoretically, why it is difficult? Because output gap is a kind of cyclicality concept. Like you have a potential in your economy and you have the actual GDP. So reducing that, you are tackling the cyclicality. But if you read many works, by IMF author Valeria Siva and Sudha Saxena, if you read Geeta Gopinath, there are many articles recently came from. You can read the IMF blog. In the IMF blog, these tough technical articles are placed in a very non-technical manner for the wider audience. So take a look into the IMF blog articles. There, you get a sense that every time, in the context of an emerging economy, it is not about the cyclicality of the growth. Like in the post-pandemic period, if you look into the GDP numbers, there is a drop in the GDP numbers. So economists are grappling with that. Whether that drop in the GDP is a permanent scar, or is it a permanent dip, or if the RBI, the Monetary Policy Authorities, and the Ministry of Finance, if they do counter-cyclical policy narrative, we will get a cyclicality and upturn. So then, things are okay. But we were doing many counter-cyclical policies in India, but the growth was not as expected. Then, we need to tackle the structural bottlenecks in the economy. So everything is about growth. This policy coordination is also about growth. Now, in the recent advanced estimates, we came to know that India is growing around only 6.4%. So if the potential we are anticipating is 7, 6.4 or around is not that, much deviation. But if you ask me, 6.4 is not enough. And if you unpack that estimate of the growth, it is capital formation-led growth. GFCF is high, the capex is high, but when you look into the consumption, the private consumption-related components, it's not huge. It is a capital-led growth. So consumption ought to boost. So this is a background in which the Union Budget 2025 is pitched. So twin objectives of the budget 2025, if you look into, one is to sustain the capital formation momentum. The second is how to boost the economy, the aggregate demand. So these were the two major objectives or the challenges before the finance minister when she was announcing 2025 budget. Now it is not only internal, you get challenges externally as well. So it's a geopolitical crisis. You have a lot of crisis in terms of your energy transition because we have long-term climate commitments and we have the supply chain disruptions which eat into your inflationary components. So there are many challenges which we call as polycrisis. If you look into the works by Adam Tooze, he's a Colombian economist, so he writes about this polycrisis, the context of polycrisis which world is going through right now. So against this backdrop of the polycrisis, what are the policy coordination which are important and required for tackling this growth recovery process? So given this polycrisis and given the growth plummeting within India, it was the onus of your finance minister to give you the reforms, the fiscal reforms, to sustain the growth recovery process. So what are the ways in which she announced? One, she focused on her capex and she focused on fiscal consolidation. So if you ask me what is the punchline of the 2025 union budget, then I say that she has not deviated from the path of fiscal consolidation. Because we need to project our macroeconomic fundamentals are strong, we are fiscally disciplined to maintain the animal spirits, to maintain the private investment. So we cannot affect the investors' confidence. So if you ask me, the prime truth of this budget is she has not deviated from the fiscal consolidation path. So how do you interpret consolidation? How do you consolidate? Like she has a crucial target, that is fiscal deficit to GDP target. And what exactly is fiscal deficit? That is a net borrowing requirement of your country. So the fiscal deficit to GDP that she announced that she's pegging it at 4.4% of GDP. But if you look at the long-term fiscal path she has announced in the post-pandemic period, what she promised was only 4.5% of GDP. That was she promised by 25-26. But if you look into the budget, it's like a harsh fiscal consolidation. It's not even 4.5, it is 4.4. Now you have to ask the question, fiscal consolidation is growth enhancing, fiscal discipline is growth enhancing, or this harsh fiscal consolidation is affecting the growth recovery process? This is an important question. Why I am asking this? Because you need to look into the part of the fiscal consolidation. So how you consolidate, how you reach to that 4.4% of GDP or fiscal deficit. One part is you keep your taxes buoyant. Then it's okay. There is no expenditure compression. But if your taxes are not as buoyant as you expect, then the only way is that you need to do a harsh expenditure compression. And expenditure cuts or expenditure compression or fiscal austerity has not served the purpose. If you look into the European economy context, European Union, they have gone through the fiscal austerity. The fiscal consolidation of fiscal austerity, it came from the European Union context when they came together. When the monetary policy was exogenous, they gone through this Maastricht Treaty and announced that 3% of GDP their fiscal deficit. But now the European Union is also undergoing this process of severe fiscal austerity. But fiscal austerity is not growth enhancing. So that harsh fiscal consolidation through expenditure compression, we can see that point for a moment. We can open it up when we have a generalization. It is not that great. The way she consolidated, it was 4.4 to the GDP. Look, fiscal arithmetic looked very much okay. But how she attained that arithmetic is an important analytical exercise we have to look into to understand. So we have the tax front, and what are the major tax reforms she announced in this budget? Taxes has two components, right? One is a direct tax component, the other is indirect taxes component. Indirect taxes component is mostly the decisions by the GST Council, which is outside the purview of the union budget. And direct taxes, there are two important direct taxes. One is your personal income tax, the other is the corporate tax. So, corporate tax, the decisions we have taken much earlier. We have helped the private investors to come in by reducing the corporate tax rate, but has it helped or not is an empirical question. So, globally also, there is a concern about this competitive regime to attract this mobile capital. You know that this capital is mobile, right? So to attract the mobile capital, countries enter into a tax war by reducing it competitively. So they attained a global minimum tax decision that 15% let it be. That's a pillar 2 of policy negotiations, that in the international taxation decisions, the corporate tax, the global minimum tax let it be 15. That's a decision. But in India also, we over the years reduced the corporate tax. Now, the personal income tax in India 950, as you know, as Shrija ma'am told, I work with the policy think tank of the Minister of Finance. We always look forward to the direct tax code reforms every time when the budget was announced all these decades. But it has not happened. So when the direct tax related to the personal income tax that will be simplified, then it will be rationalized. So these questions were there in our mind. But this time, the country, our government has taken a very important decision that they have gone into the simplification of the personal income tax. So, I was told that when you compare the last DTC codes, it's a big book in the NIPP library. Now it's like half the size. The language is very simple. It is not that tough legal language. So the tax experts will lose a job, I think. So, a lot of reforms have happened to simplify the personal income tax. So we announced in the last budget up to 12 lakhs, you don't have to pay any taxes. So, we were anticipating like Subhash Garg, who worked with the Minister of Finance. So he wrote an article, you can take a look into that and Google it. So you can take a look into that. So Subhash Garg, he's thinking like this, like after some point of time, if we elect this government back to power, will they announce that below 25 lakhs you don't have to pay any taxes? Are we going towards a zero income tax regime, which Surjit Tala, many economists were asking for zero income tax regime? Are we moving towards that? What exactly is this? This is one way of thought. The other group, the smarter group, they are thinking a little differently. Like we have to correlate this taxation reforms, with the pay commission. So the 8th pay commission is already formed. So we will get salary hike. By 2026 February, we will get salary hike. So this new revised taxation announcements and this increase in the tax, increase in the salary which is going to happen with the 8th pay commission, will it nullify, will it neutralize? What exactly is going to happen? We don't know. So these are the concerns, but it's a relief. In the post-pandemic period, there was a crisis. So this is a tax relief. I take it like that and nothing more, nothing less. I keep it at that level. Why? Because why I'm not thinking that it's not going to boost the consumption demand or the aggregate demand in the economy. One, like 2 or 3% or 2.5% of the Indian population entirely benefited from this tax reform. So in our country, 2.5 trigger the entire aggregate demand or not, we don't know. But it's a major component to trigger the urban demand, which was suffering when the advances to be scaled. So in that way, it's a big relief. But again, it is divided like direct taxes. It's a research question. Direct tax reforms and boosting the consumption demand. Is there any powerful link between these two? We need to ask. Or do we need to take care of many other fiscal instruments to tackle the aggregate demand, or the taxation reforms will do the magic? It's not a magic bullet. So that question is open, and Lekha Najin, many economists believe that it will not, because the consumption, that rise in the disposable income, that fee will not entirely go to the consumption of the buying goods. It could be that propensity to save may be higher, or in the livelihood crisis or in that post-pandemic crisis, many households may be using that perceived rise in the disposable income for taking care of their credit. The credit culture was huge. When you correlate this fiscal arithmetic with the RBI statistics of credit deployment, that's a high frequency statistics. You have to read the credit deployment. In the credit deployment, you have industry, you have personal credit deployment. If you look into that credit, the people taking credit to repay their past credit, that was very high, that credit culture. So what exactly are we talking? Like people are getting into debt or what? Why they are taking one loan to repay the earlier lower. So these are the concerns like we had, and it was a very high interest rate regime as well. So we need to know whether this purpose to trigger the economy, or whether the propensity of the propensity to save will be higher, or whether they will get into the equity markets. Like many households, they usually save in the term deposit. But now, we can see the trend of Indian population, of Indian families getting into equity markets. At least 1% of the salary they are ready to take towards the mutual fund or the equity markets, or a little bit in stock markets. But I couldn't imagine, like when I joined my office, like I was doing more of a term deposit than getting into the this equity markets. But now the students and this generation is very smart. They are even testing the crypto waters, right? Like they are able to take the high, risk to get the high returns. So there are different fiscal instruments. So we need to see what is the analytical link between the direct tax reform and the consumption boosting. So that link is an empirical quest. So that's about the direct taxes front. Now, coming to the loss in the revenue, like $1 trillion rupees we lost by announcing this. So this revenue stability is very important for designing your spending, right? So this revenue stability or the loss in the revenue will affect the way you design the expenditure for the next financial year. So the next FY, when we decided, you have to take a look into the size of the government. What exactly is size of government? It is total expenditure to GDP. So if the total expenditure to GDP or the size of the government is shrinking, then what exactly are you talking about in terms of boosting the economy? Because there is a role of the government. The government needs to play, when the economy is in crisis. So the size of the government, and size of the government is a determinant of many factors. And we had a thesis on size of government and globalization. Another thing which you can look into the size of government, poly-crisis. So there are different ways in which you can analyze the size of the government. And now the Western world, the geopolitical uncertainties, and what's happening with the central bank and decisions that are equally important to understand, this size of the government. For instance, by the US, by Trump, he had the tariff wars, and more than these tariff wars and all, what I am worried about is what the Fed, the US Fed is going to decide. Now, they have paused, like they were in a very hawkish mode, but they have paused it right now. So what the Fed Reserve or the US Bank, Fed Reserve, what they are going to do, it's very important for an emerging economy. Like Rekha words, it's called better thy neighbor hypothesis. Like whatever decisions you are taking, it is not that your balance sheet you need to be considered, because your decisions will affect the emerging world. So how the US Fed decisions affect the foreign capital, if you look into, we have two components of foreign capital, right? One is a very relatively stable FDI. We have policy announcements related to that direct investment, but this foreign portfolio investment is highly fickle. Like the hot money component is very high. So that respond to whatever happens in the Western world or in the Fed Reserve. So if the foreign capital, in terms of the hot money, so how do you define the hot money? It responds to this interest rate differentials. Higher interest rate, this hot money will vanish to that place. So if RBI reduce the interest rate, then if the Western world is giving high interest rate, there will be capital flight. So we kept our interest rate throughout to avoid this capital flight. We kept our interest rate high because financialization of saving was a concern. And we kept our interest rate higher because global mountain inflation reduced the interest rate. Why? Because the global inflation is little easy, and they have paused in the Western world. There's a little concern about this hike in the interest rates, and there is a space over there. So now, another important thing to look into is negative interest rates. If your inflation is higher than the nominal interest rate, then the real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus inflation or inflationary expectations. If the real interest rate is into negative, then that leads to erosion of money, right? The value of money. So the RBI governor should take care of those aspects as well. We should not get into the negative interest rate regime. So these are important concerns. Bank of England, many easily, if you look into Fed, each of the central banks have their own nominal anchor of the inflation. It is not like 4. In India, we have decided that let 4% inflation be the official inflation to be allowed. But of course, it is a flexible band, like plus or minus 2. Like up to 6 is okay, but beyond 6 is not tolerable. RBI governor needs to explain why it is above the comfort zone. So that is a very important concern. So we always tackle the inflation to be within the 4%, the nominal anchor. But in US it is 2%. So different country interpret that official thing differently. Now, based on the inflationary expectations mandate, the RBI decides on the policy rates. So what exactly is an inflation targeting framework? I mentioned about this nominal anchor, the 4%. Then we again have an unobserved variable over here to tackle, that is inflationary expectations. And in US you have Livingston Index survey. In India we have survey to capture that unobserved variable, that inflationary expectations. RBI floated different household surveys to capture the inflationary expectations. So in the inflation targeting framework, you peg your policy rate. Now what's announced is 6.25. It is linked to this inflation anchor, inflationary expectations and output gap. So that's what I always tell my students that there is a paper which was presented in IMF that women, central bank chief, they tend to keep the interest rates very high. They tend to go hawkish if the output gap is narrow. That's a study. That was presented in IMF. Why they do that? If the output gap is narrow, then the growth recovery process is not an important concern. So they can maneuver with the policy rates to be higher to tackle inflation. So here in India, in the new monetary policy framework mandate, inflation containment is the sole objective of RBI. So prior to that, prior to Urjit Patel, he's our chairman of NIPF, prior to the Urjit Patel recommendations, prior to the new monetary policy framework, which started in February 2006, like in our Dr. Y.V. Reddy's regime, Dr. Subbarao, they all have books about their experiences. You should read if you want to know about the central bank experiences. Like Subbarao has a book, Who Moved My Interest Rates? Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Advice and Dissent. That's the name of the book. Lekha Rajan's book is I Do What I Do. Yeah, there's a book. So and Janet also have. So these books are you should read, because these practitioners' experience we will not get from the monetary policy book or in our syllabus. So these are the practical experiences they have noted down. So you take a look into this, but you will understand that the regimes are entirely different. If you read, Y.V. Reddy, what decision he has taken as an RBI governor, he kept his interest rates constant. And Subbarao's regime was a hawkish mode. So different, and Lekha Rajan always had a tug of war with the knob block that he didn't reduce the interest rates because he wanted to tackle all the things I listed, like capital flight, mounting inflation, financialization of savings. He cannot think of negative rate of interest, but at the same time, Nirmala Sitharaman wanted the rates to be reduced. Why? If he reduces the rates, she will be having a very good time in terms of public debt management. Because if you decompose the debt, a major component is your past liabilities, which is the interest payments. If the interest rate is very high, the interest payments will be very high. And take a look into this budget as well. What is the interest payments? If it is huge, about 10 to 15% of the revenue receipts, that ratio is very important. Interest payments to revenue receipts. If it is more than 10 to 15%, what exactly you are talking about? You are earning and your money is going to for the past liabilities, debt servicing. Then it crowd out the productive investment which you can make in the economy. That's very important to look into. So when you look at the fiscal consolidation, when you look into the FRBM, the fiscal responsibility and the budget management, there are important variables to be looked into. One is interest payment to revenue receipts ratio you need to look into. If it's about 10, you think about yourself, like you have little pocket money and a huge component of that pocket money you have to spend it for your past debt with your friends, then little money you can invest, right? So your money will be, that kitty will be less. So like that you can superimpose your thought process in the country. And how do you use your money? That is okay, but how you use that money, that's very important. And if you borrow from your friend and if you throw parties, and she was talking about flash mob, these are new terms for me, okay? See, if you have a lot of parties related to the things happening in the campus, then you didn't create any value with the money you borrowed. So to repay, how do you do that? Again, you do a Ponzi finance. Ponzi finance means you will go to another friend, take some money, and in terms of interest rate, if she tells that you have to give me an interest rate which is higher than the previous debt you have with another friend, that is Ponzi finance. Like you're taking one debt to pay off another debt. If you compare the interest rates, if the new interest is higher than the earlier interest rate, you are into a Ponzi game, Ponzi finance. So you shouldn't be doing that because it's an eternal, perpetual debt you are creating for yourself. So that is not a welcome trend. But if you take little debt, which is very important for you to build something productively, then you earn some income and you can repay the debt, right? So that's okay. That's the way we tackle this debt sustainability literature. And that consolidation is interpreted by economists differently. One is debt, a favorable position by economists towards debt. We call it mostly Keynesian literature. Like Keynesians believe that, okay, a timely debt or a timely deficit is good because this will create capital formation, this will create infrastructure in your economy, which is important for you to crowd in investment. That's okay. But there is a predominant narrative in among the economists, like most of the economists and neoclassicals, they believe that no, this debt is detrimental. The deficit is detrimental. Why? Because it's crowded out. Like if you increase 1% in the public investment, that is going to decrease your private investment by $1. It's a displacement. And the narrative given by the government of India is that no, we are crowding in because you understood, no? What is happening in actually, I tell you. We have a lot of funds in the market, right? It's like a bond financing, I'll tell you. We have loanable funds in the market, and he's a private sector. You're all private players. I am government, you just imagine. So within this loanable pool, I am taking money, bond financing for financing my high deficit. So you can argue with me that I am preempting the resources which is otherwise available to the private sector. So if I do that continuously, will it shoot up the interest rate? Will the private investor will be crowded out? So these questions. So the finance minister's narrative is that, of course, I do this preemption, I do bond financing because it is much better than going to the foreign external market to get, because Sri Lanka's thing you just imagine, it's external debt financing. I cannot ask RBI to print money to finance my deficit because that will be inflationary pressures. So given the modes of financing of deficit, this is relatively better for me. So I will do a domestic bond financing because this has macroeconomic consequence in terms of your BOP and all. If I go external, conditionalities, if I do sewerage financing, sewerage is high-powered money to GDP. There is a print money using the treasury bills, you finance your deficit, which we have done long back, and through an institutional reforms in Rangarajan's period, they controlled monetized deficit. Like net RBI credit to the government, they used to do continuously. That is controlled. Now, one is relatively this is better is my argument. Then as finance minister, I also have to give you assurance that I am not crowding out. I may be preempting the loanable funds to finance my deficit, but you see how it is linked. My high deficit is linked to the capital formation economy. I am using it for infrastructure which can crowd it. So this is the theoretical or a priori or ex ante position of a finance minister. Now we are scholars, we need to test it empirically. whether this position is correct or not. Because the private investment is shy. You need to model the private corporate investment. So recently, we have done that exercise with the Ministry of Finance. Two little boys, Venkat and Ajay, they work with the Ministry of Finance. They were involved in writing the portion of economic survey. So in that portion of economic survey, they are like doing a lot of graphs and explaining that the government's capex formation is very good. So now they are asking me a question: how can we do an empirical model back into what we are doing for our country? And now it's a time to take a call on its impact. We are doing capex formation continuously. In the post-pandemic time, the predominant narrative is like, let there be high deficit, but it is for the capex formation. Now it's a question. You have to test it empirically whether it is working or not. So they needed to model private corporate investment. And private corporate investment is a function of many variables. Like your RBI, interest rate is a function. Interest rate is a determinant. It's not a magic bullet that you reduce interest rate and your corporate investment will go high, but it is a crucial variable. Public infrastructure investment is a crucial variable. Then what are the other variables? If you are a private investor, you think about it. The GFCF, the gross fixed capital formation in the private sector, that data you get from the national, that account statistics, that GDP, GFCF, private, public, everything you get from that stats. Okay, then you have to ask this question: which are the sectors crowding in, which are the sectors crowding out? But that model you need to make. In that model, a powerful variable is what I explained to you earlier, which is the output gap or uncertainties. Policy uncertainties or macroeconomic uncertainties could be a variable which affects the private corporate investment. So when you model, you have public infra, you have interest rate, you have the policy uncertainties or the macroeconomic uncertainties, and many variables, that control variables you need to do so that you get a relationship properly between the public infrastructure investment and privately corporate investment. But you need to have control variables. So this is the test of the theory, or the test of the narrative put forward by Indian government, that the capex is working or not. Now, why the capital is shy? Have you thought about it? Because we have done a heavy lifting. Not only union government, in every union budget, we also announced that $1 trillion, 1 trillion rupee is given to the state governments. Because state governments are equally partners for the capital formation. So we started giving money to the state governments. So capex formation, if you look around, Mayora Pada, Kadalora Pada, we are seeing that infrastructure in front, right? A lot of things are happening, but still, why the private investment is shy? When you ask this question, one, is it a policy dilemma that we have not boosted the consumption, or we don't know our demand? Uncertainties about the demand is, making that private sector shy from investing. Why the capacity utilization is below? Why that is happening? One is, you can ask this question: why it is happening? Is it because the uncertainty about demand? What we can do about demand? Second, don't forget about the twin balance sheet crisis that has happened. Like we were grappling with the corporate debt balance sheet, corporate and the bank balance sheet, and there was a moral hazard issue. Like we used to do a recapitalization using the taxpayers' money. We were cleansing up that what is happening with the bank balance sheet. We have done recapitalization, but it's a moral hazard. Moral hazard means we agents, economic agents, we think that okay, we can take excessive risk, somebody else will help me. Like that, if you think that's a moral hazard and you get into different exposure. Right now, what is happening with the currency market is also, I don't think, it's a moral hazard. Like RBI is intervening continuously. So the corporate is taking more dollar exposure, thinking that, currency stability will be continuously arranged by the RBI. So you read an article in Ideas India recently written by my previous colleague Lekha Patnaik. She's a very famous macroeconomist, and my colleague Radhika Pandey. So they have taken a look into this currency, what is happening with the volatility, what is done by RBI is correct or not. And IMF has changed that status, like from that managed float. Now we are categorized as a, we are stabilizing our currency. We are intervening continuously, whether that's good or bad. And there was a lot of troll for the finance minister, because when she announced dollar is going stronger. Actually, I feel sad that was the truth. Like the Trump is doing a lot of things to strengthen the dollar, and it is having its impact on the emerging markets currencies. Then, as economists, what we have to do, we have to see the volatility of rupee and the other emerging countries' currencies. So if you compare that, if the rupee's volatility is relatively lesser than other emerging country markets' volatility, then you can take that statement like rupee is relatively stable despite this free fall when compared to the emerging countries. That is one graph you can take a look into. Now then you look into this volatility question intertemporally. Like the volatility which is happening right now in this 2022 to 2024 period is relatively higher than the volatility we experienced or lower. So when they did in this paper the volatility intertemporally, it's not that volatile, that's what they are arguing, but their policy inference and policy advice to the RBI in that paper is don't intervene. Let it be a dirty flow. Don't intervene. If you intervene, you're giving unwanted signals that about a moral hazard, that you are there. So this dollar exposure by the corporate will be more, by the investors will be more. So don't intervene. That's the policy take. But you can counter-argue. You can take a look into that paper. Then there are a lot of articles coming about the new monetary policy framework as well. You have to take a look into those related literature. And you are there on Insta, then follow NIPFP. We have a page in Insta, so students can follow NIPFP. Okay. Then we post our, the policy brief, our working papers, these related faculty papers, everything in that Insta. There's a page. So you will get, updated about the works which we are doing on the fiscal and monetary policy. I'm talking about Insta because relatively youngsters are all in Insta, right? But we do a lot of tweets and all, but I'm not asking you to come on Twitter because it's too harsh. But Insta means you're comfortable in that. That's why I'm telling you, join us on Insta. So you get these papers, and we recently posted this INA's paper called the paper on the currency volatility. So take a look into that paper about the thing. Now, what is your hunch in the coming up monetary policy committee meeting? Will they reduce the interest rate further, or will they maintain this by 25 basis point? They have reduced. They maintain this, or they will further reduce. I am asking this question because if you ask me what is the role of the fiscal policy, can they remain more accommodative? No, we are reaching a last slide. Like beyond this capital formation, given the fiscal space is impossible. And if you look at the fiscal marksmanship, like capital expenditure being envisioned, and after 1 year, there's revised estimates come. The budget happens in 3 phases, you know that, no? First, along with the budget speech, we put forward the budget estimates. But after 1 year, the revised estimates will be published. If there is a deviation between what you aspire and what you got, then you had it, like the fiscal forecasting errors. That will affect your fiscal space, right? So a lot of things can happen if there is a deviation. And there is deviation related to the capital budgets. And you can take this experiment of fiscal marksmanship for all the macro fiscal parameters. Open the union budget at a glance document. Take the table, the first page table or third page. First page there will be definitions. Third page there will be a comprehensive one table on macro fiscal parameters. In that table you will get the major taxes, major expenditure and the deficit indicators in one table. Then you have to take a look into, and the years in which they report is like the actual of 2 years back will be reported. Then the last year's budget estimate and revised estimate will be reported. Then this year's budget estimates, what we are paying. So that table is a comprehensive table, and take a look into that table and do a one-pager. This exercise will help you in future also, because I know my previous boss, who was a professor in NIPFP, DK Srivastava is now chief economist with E&Y. So he has a unit in which every quarter they produce this macro fiscal and macro monetary indicators. And students work with him as interns. Later on they join E&Y and they are asked to produce this macro indicators for the fiscal policy. And if you are mastering in one budget, then it's going to be very repetitive and you're very comfortable in doing like every quarter. But first time when you do, it will be tough. So the simple exercise you can take is like look into the macro fiscal parameters of that one table and ask a question about fiscal marksmanship. If there is deviation between the D and RE, then you have to ask the question why this fiscal forecasting errors happened. What are the macroeconomic implications of this forecasting errors? Like taxes, you promise, if you're finance minister, you're promising like I will take the taxes from the citizens up to this, and next year in the revised estimates, if your promise is like, you have not fulfilled your promise, then I can ask you, then what will happen to my expenditure design? Because the fiscal space is shrunk. You told that you will get this much money, but in the next year you have not collected this much taxes. So I have done my expenditure design based on your assumption and model that I will get money up to this. So it has got serious macroeconomic implication. And if you take the deviation amount as a percentage of GDP, and if it is coming to 2%, 3%, that's the macroeconomic loss in terms of your fiscal space. Then you have to again go for an expenditure compression. So you need to take a look into the macro fiscal parameters of the taxes. Now expenditure cuts, that can also happen. Like you promise many things in the budget, but when you look into the actual, it is very, and which macro fiscal parameter suffers from this lack of fiscal marksmanship the most? In the taxes and non-taxes, you have a component in capital receipts, right? There, you promise disinvestment proceeds. And Tukit Pandey, there was news about him recently. He became the SEBI chairman or something. Yeah, he was the disinvestment ministry secretary. So he promised that he will have a lot of fiscal proceeds by selling the PSUs or disinvestment proceeds. But take a look into the disinvestment proceeds of the recent 2-3 budgets. It's a huge DE and RE deviation. Then you have to ask a question like why the disinvestment proceeds you are not getting. And recently there was a CNBC meeting. I attended that meeting. He was there, so he explained the process in which the valuation. There are a lot of things to be done with the disinvestment. So you don't get fiscal proceeds to show, but the process is on. That's what he was told. But as finance minister, she cannot depend on that number, right? If the fiscal marksmanship is the worst for the disinvestment, you believe that 60,000 will happen, and if you look at the RE, it is only 33% this year. So see that. Earlier it was like huge aspirations, the disinvestment, proceeds we used to put forward. So fiscal forecasting errors, that's very crucial to analyze. If the fiscal forecasting errors are higher, budget credibility is affected. Because you're talking about your numbers, the credibility of your numbers. So if your numbers, if there is a huge deviation, so one of the important research for both the central bank and the RBI and the North Block is looking to this deviation, the fiscal marksmanship errors. In many countries, we have a watchdog to look into these aspects. That watchdog is fiscal councils. In India, we don't have fiscal councils. So as institutions, we can argue that in the next budget piece when you write, that it's high time to get into a fiscal council. Like you look into the numbers, the budget credibility in detail, because it is affecting your fiscal space. So you can argue for an institutional reform, for appointing the fiscal councils. And these fiscal councils are a little bit political also, because they have to come and argue in the parliament about their, the finance minister is asked to be present in the parliament to explain his deficit. And in many countries it happens, and different finance ministers tackle these issues differently. MPC, who was the, MPC, right, who was the chairman of FRBM committee, who was the chairman of 15th Finance Commission. One day he was talking about this fiscal marksmanship issue in NIPFP. So he mentioned one case. I forgot the country. There in the parliament, the way a finance minister maneuvered through the decisions regarding the deficit. So politicians, right, they ask, so you want more schools because our gross enrollment ratio is suffering? You want more hospitals because our data related to morbidity and mortality statistics is such? So the parliamentarian says, we want. So then should I increase my social infrastructure budget? Then you please do. If I increase my social infrastructure budget, its implication on my borrowing, the domestic borrowing or the foreign borrowing will be going up to this. Please do. So my deficit number will not be 3%, which is the consolidation. No, we need that. Like that, you can take a call, by consultation process in the parliament and get that consensus to go for a different level of deficit. So these are the ways in which you do, the process. This happens with the central bank as well. We don't have that in India. Like whenever you discuss a rules-based macroeconomics framework, rules in the sense fiscal rules, like 3% of GDP, fiscal deficit. Monetary macro rule is inflation targeting, like 4% is your inflation. So whenever you talk about a rules-based macroeconomic principle or a question, this, articulating it to the wider audience and the parliamentarians, that's important. In many countries that happen. And if central bank chief is not able to tackle that inflation targeting within the official mandate, then he is bound to explain. And if it happens consecutively for 3 periods, then he has to explain. So Shaktikant Das was our central bank governor. When he was not keeping the mandate within the 4% consecutively for the 3 periods, they were asked to give the report why it's happening. In several countries, the central bank chief gets bonus also if he keeps the inflation within the mandate. But we don't have that bonus either. We don't have to explain also that strict rule is also not there. But these are the new transitions that's happening in the macroeconomic framework, monetary, macro, and fiscal, macro-fiscal, in terms of the rules. And many economists believe that in the Brownian motion, without rules we can't play. We need rules. And it is relatively easy to interpret. Like you have to just argue about your 4% and done with that. But there are caveats. Inflation, if it is strictly a monetary phenomenon, then by changing the repo rates, you can maneuver your inflation. But in several countries, including India, this inflation is not strictly monetary. You have supply shocks, you have onion prices shocks, you have energy price volatility. So you always ask the central bank, how do you do this supply shocks through your repo rate adjustments? What are we talking about? Then, as I mentioned earlier about an unobserved variable expectations, right? So they defend that we have an expectations channel, and RBI or the central bank always can maneuver the supply shocks through the expectations channel. Then we have to ask, as economists, another question, whether expectations channel is working in India or not. So we have done that study, and many economists look into this channels, credit channel, interest rate channel, expectations channel, the monetary policy transmission, everything. They say that expectations channel is not working. So then what exactly are we talking about in terms of inflation targeting? So these are different questions we need to maneuver. And in the post-pandemic times, the monetary policy has done a heavy lifting, especially in terms of the credit deployment. In the union budget narrative also, if we look into, that credit deployment narrative is coming back. Like if that is the case, unless there is demand, what credit deployment are we talking about? Banks are ready to give you credit. If there is no demand, there are no takers. So credit deployment as a predominant narrative of any macroeconomic policy is a matter of concern. Read a paper by Stiglitz and Rashid. he has asked that question. If the credit deployment is the predominant narrative of any government, what exactly are we talking about? One thing, we can take lot of credit which can create NPAs, non-performing assets, and we are getting into financial instability. Second is, if you are not getting enough demand from the economy, what exactly are we talking about? There are different concerns about it. Now, the latest, another important matter is related to the climate change. In the Union government budget, we announced many energy transition related announcements, critical mineral vision. So, a political economy is involved when we talk about the climate change commitments. So, when the political economic questions are involved with the climate change decisions, usually central bank or monetary policy, they are shy to take up political economic questions. And literature says that leads to reputation risk because they don't have enough methodology or tools to handle the greening of monetary policy. If that is the case, if you don't do the greening of monetary policy, in the sense that if you don't incorporate climate change within the monetary policy, then the climate related risk and uncertainties can affect your financial instability. So you need to look into, so what are the ways in which the global central banks are tackling the climate change crisis? If you take a look into that and do a global survey, like many things, if you have many AIs right now, right? So with AI, help of AI, you can do a global survey of greening the monetary policy at the global central bank. If you look into that, and ECB, Christine Lagarde is the chief of ECB, European Central Bank, she's very vocal about the monetary policy, greening, incorporating climate change. There are different methodologies. One is a stress test. Like top investors are asked to do a green stress test. There are different ways in which we can do that. How RBI does that, Like in RBI, if you look into the portfolio, first is a statutory liquidity ratio for the every banks, right? So commercial banks keep that. Then after that you do the bond financing little bit, that your business as usual thing. Then the third component of the bank is your priority sector lending, around 40%. So what was given to me, the data about greening of monetary policy from RBI is, the banks maneuver with the priority sector lending. A portion of that priority sector lending is linked to the green infrastructure. So that's the way in India we do. And another way we do the climate change commitment is by floating climate bonds. A few years back, 3 or 4 years back, in the union budget, climate bonds were announced. Like what exactly is a climate bond? I mentioned earlier that if you have high deficit, you need to finance it, right? You're financing it through the bond financing. Within that bond, a portion is thematically linked to the green infrastructure. So that is climate bond. Then you can ask, why can't gender bond happen? Gender equality is very high in India. Why can't you float gender bonds? And if there are checkers for the gender bonds, and in many countries they floated gender bonds as well for the human development. So there are different ways in which you can do thematic bond financing of deficits. So that's one way. The final way of doing the climate change commitment is, we are talking so far about fiscal and monetary. Fiscal, I'm only talking about the top government. But there is a principle of subsidiarity. Principle of subsidiarity means many decisions should happen at the level of the government closest to the people. That is a subnational government. And there will be a transfer, intergovernmental transfer that happens from the center to the states. And in that formula, this climate change criteria is incorporated. We call it as ecological fiscal transfer. So there are different studies which looked into the fly paper effect. Fly paper effect means money sticks where it is, right? If you get more transfers, then the local governments and the subnational governments don't have intensity to collect taxes. So there is an inverse relationship between the transfers and the owned revenue, and you decide your spending at the subnational level more from the intergovernmental fiscal transfers than own income. It's a kind of a public choice, like, Nish Cannon, you can read, like, there is an illusion because citizens, they don't know what is the source of that expenditure decision they have taken. So it could be the taxpayers' money, it could be the intergovernmental transfer. So bureaucracy is easier to interpret. If it is intergovernmental transfers, they are happy. They don't have to do that command and control to get more revenue, the taxes. So the flight paper can also be empirically examined by looking into the expenditure and which coefficient is having highest impact on the subnational expenditure, whether it is intergovernmental fiscal transfer or open revenue. So there are different questions they can ask related to the macro-fiscal parameters and also take the climate into concern, and we can do that as well. So yesterday there was a publication by RBI on the regulatory framework. Take a look into that, because in the new monetary policy framework, the single most significant objective of the central bank was to look into the price stability. So inflation targeting is everything, but there are many other things like currency volatility, regulatory framework. So many functions RBI had earlier, but now they are taking a relook into that. Like regulatory functions, we had FSLRC, Financial Sector Legislative Commission, has looked into this regulatory frameworks. It was taken away from the mandate, and the Monetary Policy Committee members were asked to look only into the geopolitical, the global economic scenario, project your inflation and the growth, and substantiate it, that why you have arrived at these predictions. You have the fan chart, right? You have to learn how to do the fan chart. Like it's a projections, like over the time, what are the different scenarios you can project. These are the different tools, like you learn that from your AI. Okay, these are the different tools policymakers use to do the projections and all. So that's it. We started with that decisions by the central bank, and I hope, the punchline is I hope RBI will go for more interest rate cuts now. Because regarding the capex, we have reached the last mile. So we are doing that capex for a long time. Private investment is still shy. We don't know whether they are repaying their debt and cleansing their balance sheet, or they are uncertain about the demand. So policy certainty is everything, and the policy coordination is everything. And nowhere the job of a policymaker is easy. So this coordination is very important. And globally, we are also grappling with the hidden debt. And take a look into that reels. These are the times of the short videos, right? Reels of Geeta Gopinath. IMF Insta page has got wrote a lot of reels from Christina and Geeta Gopinath. So that if you are asked to perform, you come here and speak in 1 minute about the global scenarios. You should be able to speak it in 1 minute. So that's the way in which you do these days, like a different content creation. Like you have a very analytical, detailed report in the working paper, but most of the people don't read even working paper, because this working paper is given in a non-technical manner in IMF blog. Then IMF officials, especially Geeta Gopinath and Christina, they do reels. They come and speak about the world scenario, fiscal monitor, in a 1 minute shot. So these are the things which students can look into while you prepare for your exams and all. Then take a look into the editorials. That's very important. And if you get that flow into reading the editorials, then that's the easiest way to learn the contemporary macroeconomics. Like read the Financial Times, Business Standard and other papers, editorials do this. So these are the different ways you can add. And then the strong literature, like read the book by Oliver Blanchard. It's a part of your syllabus, but take a look into his recent book, Low Interest Rate Regime and Public Debt. He published that in the post-pandemic period when interest rate was going higher. So he told that my book has relevance rate. So that's what is happening right now. Again, we are lowering the interest rate. So this happens, like you write a lot of good books, but you pitch it in a wrong macroeconomics time. It's highly volatile. So that's it, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much. Yeah. If you want to come here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, once again. Good afternoon, teachers. Ma'am, actually the talk was very, very, very informative. There was a lot of terms I came across. I just jotted down the terms, but I need to go through it again once more because I'm not really into these terms. These were pretty new for me. The class was very beautiful. I was enjoying the whole time. I was listening listening to your answers. Thank you, everyone. Ma'am, actually,
October seeing the
ma'am, in the fiscal marksmanship, I couldn't understand what was fiscal marksmanship. Then there was this term GFCF.
Okay.
Actually, this was the term.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now, Hope, can you help Navneeta in explaining fiscal marksmanship? Just one line, what ma'am told you about the fiscal marksmanship. Or you can ask your questions too.